What's going on, y'all? Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. Now, before everyone starts throwing tomatoes at me, yes, I do think that Arishem is still the best deck in the game. I don't think it's by as high of a margin as it previously was, but the way in which Loki interacts with Arishem to both be its best offensive game plan and its best defensive game plan against things like Cassandra Nova, to me mean that this deck remains at the top of the metagame. The nerf is impactful. You are doing things at a less relevant rate. And to me, that means that more of your cards need to matter than in previous iterations of this deck. Every card in this deck was chosen specifically to have as high of an impact as possible, which is why the curve is so high, and also why, incredibly, Quinjet is so important. Of these small cards that cost 1 or 2, Quinjet is by far the most impactful because so much of what your early game is now with a deck style like this is just playing the cards that were generated for you, whether that be by Loki or Agent Coulson, which usually make it easier to curve out, or just the cards that were in your deck, and Quinjet makes those easier to play as well. This is a deck that is looking for high impact out of the cards that it chooses to play. And for that reason, we are playing many 6-drops, and of course, Arishem is in the deck. So we have a deck that is composed about 50% of 5-cost or higher cards. I would not change that ratio. If you want to put a 5 or a 6 in here, I think you have to put a 5 or a 6 in for another 5 or a 6. I think we've gotten about as top-heavy as we possibly can without ending up in a very awkward situation. I feel like some swaps that may make sense are getting a Sandman in here or getting a Magneto in here. I think Blob might be the weakest of the 6-drops. I'm not exactly sure. Depending on how you approach various matchups, Doom could be a good swap out if you're seeing a lot of Clog. Doom, of course, not good in those matchups at all. I also wanted to highlight the Man-Thing slot and offer a couple options for replacements. Man-Thing is an excellent, powerful card that fits the criteria of high-impact card basically whenever you play it. A 4/7 with massive upside, this card can get as high as 4/11 or 4/13 in some situations without being vulnerable to tech cards like Shang-Chi. Invalidating small cards is actually quite important in this metagame because a lot of decks play Hawkeye cards, play 1-drops because they're looking to be Wiccan decks, because they're looking to be Bounce decks. There's going to be 1 and 2 drops on the board a lot of the time. This card is going to be hitting them, and you only run 3 drops in Quinjet that it actually hits. So you end up in a situation where this card is very often punching above its weight for a 4-drop. In terms of replacements, I actually think one card that I would look towards is White Queen. White Queen synergizes with both Mockingbird and Quinjet, and is a 4/6 that focuses, again, we're talking about card quality. When you draw your cards, you want them to really matter. One way to make your cards matter is to have them give you a good card from your opponent's deck that is big and impactful. So when we're talking about high impact cards to play, I think if you wanted to budgetize that Man-Thing, White Queen would be a good option. On the whole, Arishem remains what it always has been. An extremely strong deck, although the change to Loki has made it Loki is so far and away the best thing to do in this deck that some of the win rate and power of this deck is just entirely carried by the fact that, like, when you play Loki, you're nigh unbeatable. And that is because not only does it make you the things that people are doing to counter you worse, it is also your best offensive game plan. It's a little bit like, I'd say, grappling in MMA. You just take someone down, and then, oh, that's both offensive and defensive. You're getting off offense, and they can't get off defense. You're doing both of the things that you want to do, or that you're getting off offense and they can't get off offense. So it serves an offensive and defensive role. And that is what Loki is like in this. It's just a little bit overpowered in terms of the role that it serves. There are absolutely a million different bounce decks to cover. We're going to start with Loki Bounce, which has been popularized by Barzy, who I believe is ranked 2 right now. This is a deck that is quite powerful, but it's also quite difficult to operate. And the difficulty of operating this deck is actually very, very notably a point against it, right? Like, this is a video I make for people who are in the wider Marvel Snap community. I'm not making this video for people who are already top 100 and understand all the intricacies of operating a deck like this. This is a hard deck to play. It feels like it's often setting you up in 50-50 situations where the idea is you can automatically win as long as you don't misread your opponent. And this deck does require you to do a lot of reading. There's not a lot of very obvious wins in this deck. There's good plays and bad plays, and there's a bunch of decisions that you have to make over the course of the game, and each of those decisions will impact the end game. Basically, the decision tree for this deck is incredibly complex. The options that you have at your disposal are incredibly different, and doing something like choosing between Loki and Werewolf on turn 3 can change how the entire game would have played out. There are very few other decks where I play them and then I'm like, oh yeah, I actually just misplayed my turn 3 and that's what cost me the game. This is a deck where that absolutely will happen. The divergence in paths, if you imagine a flowchart, this is the biggest flowchart in the game. There are the most options in this deck in the entire game. There's so much to do, and there's so many different ways you can take to accomplish it, and figuring out what the best one of those ways is genuinely extremely difficult to do. You need to be very on point. You need to have practiced this deck. You need to have played a lot of it, and you need to understand the mechanics at play if you want to play this deck successfully. I do think it's strong, but it is very, very easy to mess up with, and that is a notable downside. Ajax Bounce is also, like, relative to other decks, easy to mess up with, but relative to Loki Bounce, a lot harder to mess up with because your points are so much more obvious. What you're doing is so much more clear to you. Your strategy is always a little bit more face up when you are playing it. This is a consistently strong deck. I actually think that of all the decks in the entire game, there are very few decks I would be happier to play into Arishem than Ajax Bounce. And I think that is a real point in favor of this deck because of the way it is able to scale upwards in a way that Loki is hard-pressed to replicate, and because it gets to play Cassandra Nova and Shang-Chi, and because Ajax is actually very good into Arishem decks, because it's just going to be unapproachably large in whatever lane it goes in, and they're not really playing any anti-ongoing tech with any kind of reliability. So you are able to set up situations where you're just going to blow them out, and they're not going to be really able to respond in meaningful ways. And this all combines into a package of cards that I would say is actually my favorite deck to play against Arishem with in the entire game right now. That is meaningful to me, and it is sort of overloaded on things that are good against Arishem. I get it. It is doing a lot to make that matchup good, but it does, I think, successfully accomplish this where so many other decks do not. This is the easiest of the bounce decks, I think, because it's the one that has the least clunk in it and the one that is most classically a bounce deck. Now, when I say least clunk, when I talk about the Ajax bounce deck, sometimes you're just like, I beasted on 4, I'm just going to play Ajax on 5, I don't have to worry about that, but I'm losing my beast stuff. That's almost never happening here. You are almost always in this deck just playing the obvious line. There are, like, some divergent lines, but compared to the other two lists, this is a deck that has a much more flowcharty type of output. And the way it works is simply to create as much power as possible and then have as much of that power be in your hand on turn 6 so you can pick and choose the locations that you'd like to target. Weaknesses include Eliath for some of the time, because you do have a Sasquatch to mitigate that, and of course Sandman. Now, you can beat those cards if you know they're coming, and you will have to make some pretty hard reads. Like, if you think your opponent is playing Sandman and they're like snapping you on turn 5, if you stay, you better make damn sure you beat Sandman Ultron, because if you don't, you're going to lose to Sandman Ultron. And for this reason, although this is the least skill-intensive of the bounce decks, as a bounce deck, it is actually still fairly skill-intensive because you need to know what your opponent is doing because of the ways in which this deck can get hard countered. In order to understand how to play this deck properly, it is the one that plays itself the most of the 3 bounce decks. However, I do think that even this deck requires a decent amount of metagame knowledge and a lot of sequencing knowledge so you understand how to actually play it. The goals are more straightforward, but you still need to know what your opponents are doing. Next up is Sersi Anni, and this is just a classically strong list that is very close to just being the perfect build of what it is. And after nerfs to various other mid-range decks, this is just a strong, powerful, straightforward deck that you can play with a reasonable amount of success. One card I want to highlight here is Killmonger. One of the things that is really good against Annihilus decks is blocking off the Annihilus thing. One of the best decks at doing that is a Bounce deck. Bounce loses to Killmonger if you can throw priority, and this deck is actually, like, it's weird, but it's actually pretty good at throwing priority, because you can get in these situations where you're just like, I have a really strong lane that I Sersi'd on the previous turn. Now my final turn is like Mockingbird Killmonger. I've thrown priority. I beat this Bounce gamer, right? There are situations that come up that are very similar to what I just described there. Mysterio also helps you throw priority. It is points, but it is not points that are represented on the board. So you are able to make some decent use of this Killmonger on the final turn of the game in those matchups that are normally fairly awkward. Straightforward and powerful. This is a mid-range deck that I think most people are going to be familiar with. It is strong, it is good, it is playable, it is easy. On the subject of Sersi, we can also play Wixie. This list was cooked up by Ica. I've got one change in here. I'm playing Maria Hill to make Wiccan a little bit more of a card that actually happens. That's instead of Spider-Ham, who is, it's a good card, but it's not like, oh my god, I can't believe I didn't have Spider-Ham in this game. I have been playing the Maria Hill. I think it's just a little bit better just because I like having access to that more extra energy when I can get it. And of course, this is a deck that plays Hawkeye, Kate Bishop as well. So you have access to these cards in Maria Hill, in Hawkeye, that sort of facilitate your ability to make sure that Wiccan is basically always online. So like one drop in Hawkeye, almost always going to make sure that you are able to have an online Wiccan. Maria Hill, Hawkeye guarantees it 100% of the time, unless the 2-drop Maria gives you is unplayable. Stuff like that is sort of how this deck wants to approach playing itself. And this is a deck that basically is you look at the core of it, and it is similar to the previous good mid-range deck that we talked about. It is less of a good mid-range deck. However, what it loses in consistency and just what you would describe as general good cardsness, it makes up for in explosive power, whether that comes from Wiccan or from Pixie and Mobius. One upside of being a Pixie Mobius deck is that, I don't know if you've noticed this, but there's a lot of cost reduction in the metagame right now. People are playing Loki, people are playing Beast. Those are the major culprits, and you're going to see a lot of them. Mobius is very good against that stuff, and there isn't enough Mobius for them to be reasonably running tech against it. Now, it's not as good as it used to be, and I want to dive into why real quick. The answer is actually just very simply numbers. Mobius is a 3-3, Loki is a 3-5, so even if they're not getting the discount, they are coming out 2 points ahead on that exchange, and that sucks. But it is something that is meaningful and good into those decks that are so Loki reliant. If they are really counting on that discount to allow them to do something unfair, you can drag them back to the playing field of being fair, and of course, you are able to maybe leverage it on your own by being a Pixie deck. Downside. Sometimes the Loki deck gets Mobius before you. Yeah, you just lose those. It sucks, but like, sometimes that just happens. Also, don't be afraid to just Pixie on 2 in a deck like this, even if you don't have Mobius. Sometimes you just need a high roll, and high rolling is important. This is a deck that is built to high roll, whether that be through Pixie or through Wiccan. You are trying to do something unfair. Your goal is to accomplish something that your opponent is unable to keep up with, and because of that, you have sacrificed the good cards consistency of the Annihilus deck for more explosive power. Silver Surfer remains a classic strong points deck, although there is one spot that I'm a little bit more questioning right now, and that is, of course, Nocturne slot. I'm going back and forth on Nocturne versus Red Guardian. The upside of Red Guardian is you don't really have any other meaningful interaction, so Red Guardian ends up being your best way to deal with something that can be dealt with by Red Guardian, and otherwise that you would have no option of dealing with, right? That's good. Here's the other thing, though. Nocturne is your best way of not getting Omega frickin' clogged, and I think this deck is actually fairly prone to getting rando clogged when you are in situations like, oh, I'm playing Brood or whatever, especially if you're doing Brood abs. Your opponents who are playing things like White Widow or Hawkeye, and there's not even like a lot of dedication to the clog plan necessary to get to that. you can just have decks that are playing that. Like, almost all the bounce decks will have access to that. And they'll just like, oh, well, okay, that lane's full now. Now you're kind of screwed. Can you beat me on points? Can you not beat me on points? I have Nocturne in there in deference to that, but honestly, I'm starting to feel like that's more theoretical than it is real. I would try messing around with that slot, personally. I think maybe Red Guardian is the right option to do there. Nocturne is good, don't get me wrong. Nocturne's a good card, but like, I don't think in real worlds, she is actually solving that problem for you. It seems more like a theoretical solution than a real one. And so I am fairly, very ambivalent. Like, it was a question, like, before I filmed this, I was like swapping Nocturne and Red Guardian. Now, like, that's where I'm at on this. Very much a flex slot right now. The rest of Surfer is, as you remember it, a points deck with some interaction in the form of Killmonger, but realistically not a ton of interaction. Your goal is to outpoint your opponent. Your methods of doing that are very clear, and of course, Gwenpool supplementing your Sebastian Shaw means that you are able to go surprisingly tall. One of the main things that Surfer likes to leverage is that surprise. Your surprise is an important part of what you're able to do, because your opponent might play around, you know, a brood at 4 power, but you have a brood at 6 power, and then you just completely win those games. It's a strong, powerful deck. There is nothing wrong with Silver Surfer. It is a perfectly good to great deck in this metagame. I have been playing the Beast version of the Ajax Clog list for a little bit now. I find it to be a little bit better at doing what I want to do, and a little bit less, I would say, fortitude testing than the Hobgoblin version. One thing that I ran into with the Hobgoblin version is there are safe Hobgoblin lanes and there are not safe Hobgoblin lanes, and a lot of the time your safe Hobgoblin lanes are not the lanes you want them in. Now, you do have the ability to Hobgoblin and Ghost Spider in order to create those make those unsafe Hobgoblin lanes into safe Hobgoblin lanes. You also have the ability to do that with Grapple Arrow. Please actually take advantage of that tech, because it happens with most of your Clog, right? Like, whether you play a Green Goblin, whether you play an Acid Arrow, you can Ghost Spider it, you can Grapple Arrow it. And so knowing that does make Hobgoblin better, and I do think that it is perfectly viable, perfectly good to play Hobgoblin in this deck, but also Beast allows this deck to scale a little bit higher with your bounce stuff. Personally, I think this is like a 55-45 situation where I'm currently 55 on Beast and 45 on Hobgoblin, but I don't think that's going to be like that forever, and I do think that for most people, Beast is going to be an easier card to use because they are not as familiar with the Ghost Spider Hobgoblin, the Grapple Arrow Hobgoblin, and because of that, they end up playing their Hobgoblins poorly or on locations that aren't very good. But on the whole, this is a strong, straightforward, well, maybe not straightforward. It's straightforward once you know what you're doing. You play cards, and then you play Ajax on 5, and then your final turn is like Hazmat 1-mover Dagger, or like Hazmat 1-mover Sage, or Hazmat 2-movers Dagger. It's a combo deck where the combo is the cards in your hand. One thing that I think people just don't seem to get about this deck, I had someone come into my chat and be like, Woody loves saving Dagger until turn 6. That's not like, it's not something you love. That's not like a subjective thing. Don't play that card before turn 6. It's a turn 6 card. Like, you are very rarely wanting to be an early Dagger gamer. I think the best way to explain this does come from Woody. Dagger is your Thena, and it scales off of your opponent filling up lanes. It scales off of your opponent playing cards. The longer you hold it in hand, imagine its power growing up. That's what Dagger is. Don't just like play Dagger for 6 because you like feel like you need to do stuff. You don't need to do stuff. You really don't. It's just almost always better to actually think of this deck like a combo deck, where the combo is Ajax on 5, 2-move Dagger Hazmat on 6, GG. That's the combo. This is PatriotMan, and I do not have the slightest clue what the Super Scroll spot is supposed to be. It used to be a good option to have Super Scroll in here because it was good against other Blue Marvel decks, and that makes sense to me. Right now, I have no idea what that card is supposed to be. It could be, like, generically strong 4-drop, like maybe we just play something that, like, is good, but a lot of the generically strong 4-drops don't really go with this. Like, you don't want to be a Captain Marvel in your, like, massive Ultron Doom deck, not necessarily, right? Like, what are we doing with this slot? The other thing that I wanted to point out in terms of how this list plays out is the 6-drops. Ultron is a guarantee. Dr. Doom is not. And I do think that people need, like, part of the reason I'm running Dr. Doom here is because people are expecting Red Hulks, right? Like, I want to be a little bit different. I want to be messing around with that slot. Maybe it'll be a leader in 2 days. I don't really know. But other than that, like, the 10 cards that you see here that are not named Doom and are not named Super Skrull, you know what this deck is about. It is the most straightforward of the Sandman decks, the most obvious of the Sandman decks, the most easily beatable of the Sandman decks, and the most galactic-y of the Sandman decks. And what I mean by that is, it is basically face-up at this point. Everyone knows what you're doing. Everyone knows how to play to beat it. Everyone knows to retreat if they can't beat it. It's extremely face-up, extremely obvious, extremely clear. So, the question then becomes, how do you use that Super Skrull slot and that Doom slot to create enough ambiguity that you can beat the people who think they're going to beat your obvious plays? I haven't figured it out yet. I'm hoping it's possible. I would like to put the emphasis of this Sandman deck on that. This deck is very face-up, and because of that, you have 2 slots to work with to make it face down again. That is what I would encourage anyone picking this deck up to be thinking about the most. Normie Sandman is much more face down, and it's a question of how much you're willing to sacrifice potential power in order to be face down. Because this is a deck that is actually able to disguise its Sandmans, right? If someone plays, like, Jeff, Captain Marvel, and Copycat against you, you're not thinking, oh, that has to be Sandman. You're kind of thinking, like, maybe that's like a Thena deck on a bad draw. Maybe that's just some other good cards deck. I don't really know what it is. You can catch people off guard with the Sandman in this deck. You can. Now, will you always? Not necessarily, but you definitely can. And that means that this deck has a little bit more snap equity. The real question is, will people stay after the Sandman? And a lot of the time, the answer is a smart player will not. But you would be surprised at how many players in the lower ranks, from what I've been told, are willing to stay into a Sandman because they just don't really think about, like, Ultron or whatever. They're like, I'm going to win this. It's going to be fine. I do think that, again, it's becoming less face down. People are used to Sandman Ultron. It is happening more. But I wouldn't be surprised if it, you were still, like, in a non-infinite rank at this point. I wouldn't be surprised if you still caught people by surprise by this one. It's a little bit more known than it used to be. That's definitely true. It is worse than when it used to be as known as it is. Also true. All of the decks piloted by good players who are weak to this are going to be attempting to be aware of it, whether that be Bounce or what have you. You are also a deck that is not great into Loki, because if they Loki you, a deck that normally would be a beatable matchup like a Bounce deck becomes a very hard matchup to beat because suddenly they're playing your big things on the final turn of the game. There are things pushing against Sandman. And I think the number one thing pushing against Sandman is that Loki is a much more common card now. That's bad for you. It really is. You didn't think we'd get through one of these without talking about Thena, did you? Come on now. The issue with Thena is I just haven't found a list I absolutely love. It feels like a lot of the bounce decks tend to have like a good matchup into this, because they are able to mostly dodge your tech and generally throw priority and then outpoint you on the final turn of the game. And some of them are also Loki decks, and it's just this very awkward situation where, like, it's usually not very great to Loki into a bounce deck. There's a lot going on, basically, but I haven't found the perfect configuration of cards for Thena. This is the generic classic good cards Thena list, but there are so many other directions you can go with this. You can be a Darkhawk deck. You can go back to the more move-based strategies with Juggernaut. You can do a ton of stuff with this deck. However, this is just an option. I wanted to sort of cover the archetype in one deck, and I think this is a good example of the confusion that is Thena decks right now. It's possible, I think, to me, that the best points package has become Bounce. Werewolf by Night, Kate Bishop, stuff like that. The ability to, like, fuse Clog into your game plan with White Widow and Beast and Viper and Hood and Kate. Maybe that's just a little better than Thena is right now. I'm not sure. We're going to have to find out. But there's a bigger question mark over Thena for me than there has been basically since she came out. She has been consistently, like, one of the strongest cards in the game since she came out. Consistently the best option For an early scaler, I still think she's very good, but I'm gonna have to wait and see if she is able to forcefully reclaim her throne as the best points package. Until such time, I'm still gonna keep tinkering. Speaking of tinkering in Thena shells, I played a little bit of the Wiccki deck. Now, this is it's built along the same principles as my day one Wiccki deck, but I think it's like a little bit more straightforward, a little bit more just points based. My day one deck was using a lot of randomly generated cards and tech cards. This deck is like, what if instead of being a randomly generated card deck, we were a Thena deck, so no more collector, none of that. But also, what if we just played Sandman endgames? What if we were just like an Ultron and Red Hulk deck? What if we just played big points as much of the time as we could? Because when we end up being a Wiccan deck, those are cards we get to play early. We get to like curve Red Hulk into Ultron. It's a really powerful thing to do. I'm not sure if this archetype is solved. I'm really not. But I do think that there is a lot of promise here for Loki plus Wiccan. Because I will say, in every Loki Wiccan deck I've played, it feels like playing Loki into an active Wiccan is basically cheating. A 3/5 that makes your deck better and also draws a card. A 4/7 that gives you 2 extra energy. And then the rest of the game is just you doing things you shouldn't be able to do. That is a very strong thing. I've referred to that combo as sort of build your own Arishem. That is honestly what it's like. Like, you feel like you are doing things that are vastly stronger than anything your opponent can accomplish. And I think that that is a very, very powerful thing to do. I am interested in this archetype. There is a lot going for it. Not necessarily the specific build, although I do think the specific build is, like, we're getting closer to something. But there is definitely going to be something with Loki into Wiccan and this general shape of an early game that I think will matter. Perhaps the no-brainest deck in the entire game, and I mean that as a compliment, Zoo is an extremely straightforward points deck at this point. There used to be like some stuff to consider, like some priority games to play when you were a Shadow King deck some of the time. You're not any of that anymore. Your job is points. You are the Ken of Marvel Snap. Ken's job was beach. Your job is points. That's what you do. And one thing that I want to point out is people like talking about how decks have like no brain, no skill, whatever. I think that all of those people could benefit from a mental reset. If there are 2 decks that have the same win rate, playing the easier one is always better. Period. End of story. And I know people like to think, oh, well, I can just skill out of this one. You see pro Magic players make those mistakes all the time, where they're like, I'm just going to play better than my opponent, so I'm going to play the deck that has the most options in it. I'm going to make the right decision all the time. But fatigue matters. You're playing a lot of games when you're playing a bunch of Marvel Snap. You're going to end up slipping and making mistakes. And choosing a deck where your decision-making is optimized, where you have like 2 really important decisions every game, and if you get them right, you win the game. That's actually a good long-term strategy when you're grinding a ladder, and I do think people should put a lot more respect on so-called brain-dead decks' names, because if they were so brain-dead, why aren't you playing them and getting your free wins? Namora remains a functional, plausible, kinda good deck, where this deck's ethos for existing is it is an okay points deck, but it's an okay points deck that is welded to a combo deck that goes very over the top. The downside is the combo deck that goes very over the top is weak to Alioth, right? Like, there is some of that, right? But the upside is you're a generally strong points deck that can go over the top of other generally strong points decks if they're not playing the interaction they need to beat you. And that's actually just good enough, right? Like, this is a deck, again, very straightforward, very strong, good into Sandman, because you only really need to play 1 card a turn after you Wong anyway. You just kind of go nuts with numbers here. And that's a powerful thing to do. I think I would draw the analogy between Wong and, say, something like Wixie, where this is a deck that is worse at being a mid-range deck than some alternatives, but in exchange has access to massively explosive power that wins it mid-range mirrors because a mid-range deck can't compete with that massively explosive power without having specific answers to it. And so those 2 decks occupy a sort of similar spot in my brain where they are built along similar lines. Even though they look nothing alike, their occupancy of the same metagame space sort of puts them in the same spot in my brain. This is the Do Boss Mr. Negative list, and the piece of tech being innovated on here is the fact that if you play Loki and then you play Jane Foster, you will draw your opponent's 1-cost cards out of your deck at 0 cost thanks to Jane's ability. This is a powerful interaction that you are able to leverage with meaningful impact, and it gives you the option of being both a Loki deck or a Mr. Negative deck. Both of those are snappable with Jane Foster. You end up in very good situations because of that, and the rest of this deck is exactly the deck you remember as a Mr. Negative deck. I just hit the mic. I apologize for that, but I'm leaving it in. This is a deck where your snap condition is usually also your win condition, and that's not always true. There are plenty of other decks where your snap condition is a situation that you create over the course of the game. This is a deck where your snap condition is playing a card and your win condition is also playing that card. One thing I really wanted to highlight about this deck is that a lot of it is just being a Taskmaster deck. Now, you might think that's kind of ridiculous, but a lot of what this deck can do is like Wong Sage Taskmaster. That's what wins you games that people don't really play around, right? Like, it is just something people aren't expecting is big numbers out of a negative deck. They're expecting Iron Man multiplicative numbers, but they're not expecting 20 power off of one card. And leveraging that lack of expectations is kind of what this deck is all about. People often play around one thing and then you hit them with another thing. Oh, I didn't expect them to have an Iron Man and a Sage. It sucks. You probably should have. And so you end up in this situation where this deck is just unexpected enough to be powerful and just awkward enough to be hard to predict. And that makes Mr. Negative an actually good option for this metagame. Goon Knight exists, but is hampered by two things. The first is a lack of ability to curve out unless it draws really, really well. And the second is a lack of ability to run tech cards. This deck is relying heavily on the disruption afforded to it by discarding your stuff, and the disruption afforded to it by vipering over the hood. I do think that there is, once again, something here. I've actually enjoyed the ones I've seen that have put Kate Bishop in here, but I can't figure out how to get Kate Bishop in here and also keep being a Hood Viper deck, and I really would like to figure that out. Part of me wonders if maybe what we're supposed to do is just actually run like Kate White Widow and just be like, look, it's going to be fine. We're never going to run into the Moon Knight issue. It's going to be fine. We're never going to discard our own cards. I don't know if I can be greedy enough to do that, but I do think it might be a direction worth trying with this deck because it really does feel the lack of tech, and that makes me want it to be a bit more of a clog deck than it currently is. And so I'm ambivalent on this. I do feel like there's maybe something here, but I also feel like maybe it's being better leveraged in other shells right now. Destroy remains playable. It's like sort of the baseline of a deck that you can play that is not incredibly embarrassing, but it is a little bit embarrassing. Destroy's issue fundamentally is that in order to keep up with the things other people are doing, it kind of needs its good draws every game. But when it gets its good draws, it is a very powerful, very strong deck that is still incredibly weak to almost every interactive card played. So you end up in a situation where you have this snap profile where it's like, all right, I got my good draw, I need to snap it, but you can't really snap it because not only are you weak to cards that people don't play a ton of, like Armor and Cosmo, you're also weak to stuff like, Juggernaut, for example, or Mobius turning off your Death, or Enchantress blowing up your Null, or Shadow King blowing up your Deadpool. And I think all of those cards are a little less common than they were just a bit ago, which means Destroy is better positioned than the last time I made one of these videos, but it is still in a fundamentally awkward spot in the metagame where it's a high roll deck that is weak to every single tech card in the entire game. Honorable mention to Clog Sera. I have been seeing Jimmy Dickens play something very similar to this. I don't know if this is exactly his list, but it is just a fairly strong, powerful thing to do. Clog is good. There are multiple iterations of Ajax Clog on this list. This one's an honorable mention because it's the one that I have the absolute least experience with, but it's doing the same things that a lot of other strong decks do, and obviously Surprise Ajax is really, really horrifying. We also are leveraging the newly buffed man thing. The issue here is I do believe the version Jimmy is playing Luke Cage in order to deal with the issues that this card creates for you. I'm not sure if we're supposed to be doing that. My instinct is I don't want to be playing any of the cards that when Loki gets played against me, I cry myself to sleep. And so for that reason, this is sort of where I'm at with the archetype, but it is the archetype I've played the least of. I do think that there is potentially something here. I'm unsure exactly how different this is from, say, the Ajax Dagger list. It feels like it's like 8 of the same cards, right? Like it's a very similar list to that with just like some different things going on there. I do like that it's able to have these surprise turn 6, like Man-Thing Shang-Chi. Really scary, really hard to beat. And there is a lot going on there, but also I like that it is able to basically surprise turn 6s are very powerful. This is playing a bunch of cards that are already good and we all know they're good. The Clog sub-theme is very strong. Ajax is very big. I find it hard to believe this is actually bad. Classic Shimmy Phoenix Force is still doing that classic Shimmy Phoenix Force thing of beating people who are unprepared to deal with any of it. There are a lot of sort of, not necessarily small ball mid-range decks, but like these bounce decks that are playing Loki, these Thena decks that are playing Loki. They're relatively small ball compared to a Phoenix Force Nut Draw. They're not playing a lot of Shadow King. They are Nimrod vulnerable as well. There's just a lot of ways for this deck to be like, I'm going over the top. Sorry, dude. Also, nice Loki, dummy. Now, sometimes like an early enough Loki out of Arishem can actually result in some problems for you if they draw the right stuff off of it, because they're basically drawing as many cards as you are at that point off the top of the deck. But you are going to be in mostly favored situations against Loki decks, and I do think that is really worth highlighting because these Loki decks are so everywhere that just being a deck that can go over the top of the mid-range decks that are playing Loki, that is actively good into Loki, where you're actually happy to be like, suck it, Loki, get out of here, that's rare. And I think it's important that a deck like that exists. I do. And I think Phoenix Force is that deck right now. It might be better positioned as we move towards a more Loki-centric metagame than it has been in an extremely long time. One thing I would like to avoid if you end up picking this deck up is please be painfully aware of the card Alioth. If you end up playing these situations where you just get Alioth to death, you do need to worry about that. One of the big ways this deck can lose cube equity is getting your entire final turn Alioth. So like if you feel like maybe it's time to, okay, I've got my Shuri Nimrod lane, maybe go spider that Nimrod out of there if you can, so you don't just get it Alioth. That is something to keep in mind. Holy crap, that is such a long episode of the best decks. Thank you so much for sticking with me through all of it. I have been KM Best. Let me know what you thought about these decks in the comments. You think I missed one? Let me know. I still read every comment. I've been KM Best. You've been phenomenal. I will see you in the next one.